The dog was sitting on top of Robert's grave, and Margaret's first thought, standing there in her nightgown and coat at 5 in the morning, was that her husband had somehow sent her a message from the other side, and she was either losing her mind or finally seeing something true for the first time in 3 months. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there on the wet grass, keys still in her hand, engine still ticking behind her in the empty cemetery lot, and stared at a yellow Labrador who was staring right back at her like it had been waiting all night for someone to come. Have you ever stood in front of something that made no sense and felt your whole chest crack open anyway because some part of you understood it before your mind did? That was Margaret on a Tuesday morning in October, 68 years old, 3 months a widow, standing at the edge of a gravel path with fog rolling low across the headstones, looking at a dog with no collar and no owner in sight, sitting exactly where her husband's name was carved into granite. She would spend the next several weeks trying to explain it away. She would fail. And by the time she understood why that dog had chosen that grave, out of every grave in that quiet Ohio cemetery, she would understand something about her husband and about love that 41 years of marriage had never fully shown her. But that morning, all she knew was that her heart was pounding, her hands were shaking, and there was a dog sitting on Robert's grave like she had every right to be there. Margaret Ellis had been driving to that cemetery every single morning since the funeral, not because anyone told her to. Not because grief counselors recommend it, though hers had gently suggested she might want to find other rituals, eventually. She went because the house had gotten too quiet, and the cemetery, strangely, had not. There was wind there. There were birds. There was a bench Robert's brother had donated with his name on a little brass plaque, and Margaret would sit on that bench with her coffee going cold in her hands and talk to a man who couldn't talk back. She told him about the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. She told him the neighbor's grandson had gotten into college. She told him she still hadn't figured out how to work the snowblower, and if he had some kind of afterlife access to hardware manuals, now would be a good time to share. She never expected an answer. She had stopped expecting much of anything. Robert had died in July, on a Sunday, in the recliner he'd owned for 11 years, with a baseball game on low and a cup of decaf going cold on the side table. 69 years old. A heart that had been strong his whole life, until suddenly it wasn't. No warning. No hospital. No goodbye. Just Margaret walking in from the garden with a handful of tomatoes and finding her husband gone, so quietly that at first she thought he was asleep. 41 years married. High school sweethearts who almost didn't get their first date because Robert was too nervous to ask, and Margaret finally asked him instead. 2 children, both grown now and living out of state, both calling every few days with the particular gentle worry of adult children who don't know how to fix their mother's grief and hate that they can't. Margaret had built her whole life around a man who filled every room he walked into with an easy, quiet kind of warmth. He was the one who remembered birthdays. He was the one who talked to strangers in grocery store lines like they were old friends. He fixed things around the house that didn't really need fixing, just to have something to do with his hands, and he loved animals with an intensity that used to make Margaret laugh. He'd stop the car for turtles crossing the road, refused to swat at wasps if they weren't bothering anyone, and once drove 40 minutes out of his way because he saw a dog that looked lost on the highway shoulder and couldn't stand not checking. They had never kept a pet of their own in the last decade. Their old sheepdog, Biscuit, had passed when the kids were still in high school, and after that, life got busy, and then it got older, and somehow a new pet never happened. Margaret sometimes wondered if Robert missed having a dog around more than he ever said. She would find out, in the strangest way imaginable, just how much. That morning in October started like every other. Margaret woke at 4:40, the way she always did now, because sleeping in the bed they'd shared for 4 decades had become something she could only manage in short, restless stretches. She made her coffee. She drove the 15 minutes to Maple Ridge Cemetery in the dark, headlights cutting through fog that hadn't burned off yet, and she parked in her usual spot near the old oak tree. She saw the shape before she understood it, a patch of gold against gray stone, low to the ground, still as a statue. Her heart did something complicated. Fear first, sharp and immediate, and then something else underneath it, something that felt almost like recognition, though she couldn't have said why. She got out of the car slowly. The dog didn't move. It watched her walk closer with dark, patient eyes, ears soft, tail giving one single low sweep against the grass, like it was greeting her rather than fearing her. "Well," Margaret said out loud, her voice cracking the silence of the empty cemetery. "You're not supposed to be here." The dog thumped its tail again. Up close, she was clearly a Labrador. Yellow gold, maybe 55 pounds, healthy looking but a little too thin, coat a little too dull, like she'd been on her own for a while. No collar. No tags. No microchip scanner in Margaret's purse, obviously, so there was no way to know anything at all, except that this dog was sitting, calm as anything, directly on top of the mounded earth that hadn't fully settled yet over Robert's grave, front paws crossed like she'd chosen this exact spot on purpose. Margaret crouched down, knees protesting the way they always did now, and held out her hand. The dog leaned forward and sniffed it, then, without any hesitation at all, pressed her head into Margaret's palm. "Okay," Margaret whispered, and her eyes were suddenly wet, and she didn't fully understand why. "Okay." "Hello." She stayed there for almost an hour. She called the dog's name, nothing, because she had none, and tried a dozen guesses, and the dog answered to none of them but stayed pressed against her leg the entire time, warm and solid and real in a way that nothing had felt real in 3 months. When Margaret finally stood to leave, the dog stood too and followed her to the car and looked up at her with an expression Margaret would spend weeks trying to describe to her daughter on the phone. Not begging. Not desperate, just certain. Like the dog had already decided something and was simply waiting for Margaret to catch up. She opened the car door. The dog jumped in without being asked twice. Margaret told herself she was only taking the dog home to get her fed and warm and looked at by a vet, and that she would spend the next few weeks finding whoever this animal belonged to. She told herself that in the car, driving home with a strange dog's head resting on the center console, and she told herself that again 3 days later, standing at the counter of the local animal shelter with a printed flyer in her hand. She believed it, mostly. Or she wanted to. The vet estimated the dog was somewhere between 3 and 5 years old, spayed, no microchip, no obvious injuries beyond mild malnourishment, and a small old scar along her left front leg that had healed cleanly a long time ago. Healthy teeth. Good temperament. "Somebody trained this dog well at some point," the vet said, running a hand along the dog's back while she sat perfectly still, watching Margaret instead of the vet, the way she seemed to watch Margaret constantly now, like she was keeping an eye on something precious. "She's a sweetheart," the vet added. "Whoever lost her is probably looking." Margaret took that seriously. She really did. She printed flyers with a photograph of the dog's face, soft brown eyes, one ear slightly bent, a small white patch on her chest shaped almost like a comma, and taped them to telephone poles and the bulletin board at the grocery store and the counter of the little diner on Main Street where she'd been having breakfast alone since the funeral. She posted in 3 different local lost and found groups online, with her daughter's help, since Margaret still wasn't entirely confident navigating a phone screen for that sort of thing. She called every shelter within 30 miles. She called the cemetery office to ask if anyone had reported a missing dog near the grounds, and the woman at the desk said kindly that this wasn't the first time an animal had wandered onto the property, but she'd never heard of one sitting on a single grave like that, refusing to leave. There was one call, in the second week, that made Margaret's heart leap into her throat. A man from the next county over who thought the dog in the photo might be his sister's, lost during a move back in the spring. Margaret drove 40 minutes with Sunday in the back seat, hands tight on the wheel the whole way, telling herself she should be relieved, telling herself this was the right thing, the responsible thing, and feeling something cold and hollow settle into her stomach the closer they got. But the moment the man's sister came out onto the porch and called out a name, Sunday didn't so much as lift her head from the back seat. The woman took one look and shook her head. Wrong dog, hers had a docked tail, and apologized for wasting Margaret's afternoon. Margaret drove home with her hands shaking on the wheel for an entirely different reason than the drive out. Relief washing through her so fast it nearly brought tears, and she didn't examine too closely why the thought of losing this particular dog had frightened her more than almost anything had since July. Nobody called about the flyers after that. Nobody claimed her online. 3 weeks came and went, and the dog, who Margaret had started calling Sunday because that was the day Robert died, and because it felt, in some way she couldn't articulate, like naming her after loss was also naming her after love, settled into the house like she had always belonged there. She slept at the foot of the bed on the side where Robert used to sleep. She followed Margaret from room to room with the quiet devotion of an animal who had decided this was her job now. Into the bathroom while Margaret brushed her teeth, into the laundry room while she folded towels. She didn't really need to fold, waiting patiently outside the shower door like a small, furry sentry. She sat with Margaret on the porch in the evenings, leaning her whole weight against Margaret's leg, and something in Margaret's chest that had been clenched tight since July started, slowly, to loosen. Margaret's neighbor, Doris, a widow herself for going on 9 years now, stopped by one afternoon with a casserole dish she didn't need to bring, and stayed for 2 hours just to watch the dog chase a tennis ball across the backyard. "You look different," Doris said, watching Margaret laugh. Actually laugh, out loud, at nothing more than a dog getting the ball stuck under the porch steps. "You look like a person again." Margaret hadn't realized, until Doris said it, how much of herself she'd been missing without knowing it. How grief had worn her down into something smaller and quieter than the woman she used to be, and how strange it was that a stray dog with no collar and no history had somehow started handing pieces of that woman back to her, one ordinary afternoon at a time. But it wasn't simple. Grief rarely lets you have anything simple. Because as much as Sunday's presence comforted her, it also unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. Every morning, without fail, the dog wanted to go back to that cemetery. Not just wanted, needed, in the way dogs need certain things, pawing at the door, whining low in her throat if Margaret dawdled too long over coffee. And every morning when they arrived, Sunday would walk directly to Robert's headstone, lie down against it, and stay there, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes longer, resting her chin on the cool granite like she was listening for something. Margaret's son, Danny, said it was probably just scent. Dogs pick up on things, he said. Maybe there was a squirrel den nearby. Maybe it was just a comfortable patch of grass. Her daughter Claire was quieter about it, more thoughtful, and one night on the phone she asked the question that had been sitting underneath all of Margaret's other questions without her fully letting herself hear it. "Mom," Claire said, "do you think Dad knew that dog?" Margaret laughed it off at the time. Robert had never mentioned a yellow lab. He hadn't owned a dog of his own since Biscuit died years ago. There was no dog in any of the photo albums, no leash hanging in the garage, nothing in the house that suggested Robert had, at any point in the last decade, spent time with an animal like Sunday. And yet, there was something in the way Sunday moved through their house that felt less like a stray adjusting to a new home and more like an animal returning to a familiar one. She knew, without being shown, which cabinet in the kitchen held the treats. The same cabinet Robert used to keep dog biscuits in, years ago, in case a neighborhood dog wandered by. She startled, the first week, at the specific creak of the third porch step, the one Robert always meant to fix and never did, and settled again just as quickly, like she recognized the sound rather than fearing it. She had a habit of leaning her full body weight against Margaret's left leg when they walked, exactly the way Biscuit used to lean against Robert's leg all those years ago, a habit so specific and so oddly familiar that Margaret found herself standing frozen in the hallway one evening, hand pressed to her mouth, unable to explain why she was crying over the way a dog was leaning against her. There was the evening Margaret dropped a heavy pot lid in the kitchen, the clatter loud enough to make her own heart jump, and Sunday didn't so much as flinch. She simply looked up, checked that Margaret was all right, and went back to resting her chin on her paws, the reaction of a dog who had lived, at some point, in a busy, noisy, loving household and learned that sudden sounds weren't something to fear. There was the way she refused, every single time, to walk past the hall closet where Robert's old coats still hung, choosing instead to sit and wait by the door until Margaret caught up, as if some part of her understood that particular doorway. Small things, things that could all be coincidence. Things that, one by one, meant nothing, but grief has a way of making you notice patterns, whether you want to or not, and Margaret, practical, steady, not a woman prone to superstition, began, against every instinct she had, to wonder if there was something here she wasn't seeing yet. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon in early November, when Margaret finally forced herself to do the thing she'd been avoiding since the funeral: clean out Robert's home office. It was a small room off the back of the house, barely big enough for his desk and 2 filing cabinets and the ugly brown recliner he refused to get rid of even after Margaret bought him a new one. Nobody had touched it since July. Margaret had walked past that closed door every single day for 3 months and simply hadn't been able to make herself open it. Sunday, for the first time since coming to live with them, refused to leave the room once Margaret finally did. She lay down in the doorway and watched, ears pinned slightly back, as Margaret worked through drawer after drawer of receipts and old tax documents, and the particular clutter that accumulates in a life lived for 7 decades. And it was in the bottom drawer of the second filing cabinet, underneath a stack of expired insurance paperwork, that Margaret found the folder. It wasn't labeled. It was just a plain manila folder, slightly yellowed at the edges, and when Margaret opened it, her breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with dust. Inside were photographs. Older ones, printed at a drugstore counter the way people used to do before phones did everything, the timestamps in the corners reading 5 years back. And in nearly every photograph, there was Robert younger by half a decade, but unmistakably him, kneeling in the gravel outside what looked like a rural veterinary clinic, with a small, painfully thin yellow lab puppy cradled against his chest, its leg wrapped in a makeshift splint made from what looked like a ruler and electrical tape. Underneath the photographs was a single folded piece of notebook paper, and on it, in Robert's familiar, slightly slanted handwriting, was an account Margaret had never once heard him tell. He had written it like a journal entry, dated 5 years earlier, describing a fishing trip he'd taken alone up near the state line. A trip Margaret remembered clearly because she'd been annoyed at the time that he'd gone without her, that he'd come home 2 days late with some story about car trouble that she'd never fully believed. The truth, it turned out, was far stranger than car trouble. He had found a puppy, no more than 10 weeks old, abandoned on the shoulder of a back highway, half-starved, one leg badly broken, apparently thrown from a moving vehicle or left behind by someone who couldn't be bothered. He had wrapped her in his flannel jacket. He had driven 2 hours in the wrong direction to find an emergency vet clinic that would take her. He had paid for surgery on her leg out of his own pocket, money Margaret had never noticed missing, because Robert had always quietly managed a separate account for what he called odds and ends. He had nursed that puppy back to health over the following weeks at a motel, delaying his trip home twice, before finally, reluctantly, surrendering her to a rescue organization 2 counties over because their own house rules Margaret herself had insisted on years earlier, after Biscuit passed, when the grief of losing a pet had felt too large to ever risk again, didn't allow for a new dog. He had named her. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that had clearly been written in a hurry, like a man trying to get his feelings down before he lost his nerve, Robert had written a single line that Margaret read 7 times before she could make herself understand it. I hope somewhere out there she remembers that somebody loved her enough to come back for her. Margaret sat on the floor of that small office, papers scattered around her, and she looked up at the doorway, where Sunday was still lying exactly where she'd settled an hour earlier, watching her with those same patient brown eyes. And Margaret understood, all at once, with a certainty that had nothing. She would spend the next several days trying to confirm it the practical way, because that was who Margaret was. A woman who trusted evidence more than feeling, even now. She called the rescue organization named in Robert's notes, a small operation. 2 counties over that, remarkably, was still in business. She described the dog. She described the healed scar on the left front leg. She asked, heart in her throat, if there was any record of a lab puppy surrendered 5 years earlier by a man named Robert Ellis. The woman on the phone went quiet for a moment and then said she'd need to check the old files because 5 years back predated their current database system. It took 4 days for the callback. 4 days of Margaret sitting with Sunday every evening, running her hand along that small scar on the dog's leg, trying to imagine Robert, kind, steady, quietly stubborn. Robert driving 2 hours out of his way for an animal he knew he couldn't keep, then giving her up because a rule he himself had never fully agreed with kept him from doing what his heart clearly wanted. Those 4 days were some of the hardest of the entire 3 months, harder in some ways than the funeral itself, because for the first time since July, Margaret found herself angry, genuinely, uselessly angry, at a man who could no longer explain himself. Why hadn't he told her? Why had he carried something so tender, so entirely him, in complete silence for 5 whole years, through holidays and anniversaries and 1,000 quiet evenings on that same back porch, without once letting it slip? She sat up late on the second night going through old calendars, trying to remember that week he'd claimed car trouble, trying to remember if she'd noticed anything different in him when he came home. A little quieter, maybe, a little more likely to reach for her hand at dinner than usual, and finding, to her frustration, that grief had already blurred so many of those small, ordinary. She wasn't angry that he'd saved a dying puppy on the side of the road. She was angry that he'd apparently believed, even for a moment, that this was a story he had to keep to himself. When the rescue coordinator finally called back, her voice had a strange, careful warmth to it, the voice of someone who had found something they weren't quite sure how to say out loud. "We found the file," she said. Owner surrender, 5 years ago, male, gave his name as Robert Ellis. Female lab puppy, approximately 10 weeks, healed leg fracture. He wrote in the notes that he wanted updates on her if we ever had them, and, "Mrs. Ellis, I don't know if this will mean anything to you, but the dog was adopted about 4 months later by a family 2 towns over, and there's a note in her file from just this past summer. The family surrendered her again in July. They were moving out of state and couldn't take her. Our shelter was over capacity, so she went out on a transport to a partner rescue, and somewhere along that transport she got loose. We never found her." Margaret had to sit down on the kitchen floor, phone pressed hard against her ear, Sunday immediately crossing the room to press her body against Margaret's side, as if she understood, somehow, that this conversation was about her. July. The same month Robert died. The math was impossible and undeniable at the same time. A dog that had escaped a transport van somewhere in the general region in the same month Robert passed away, found 3 months later sitting at his grave, in a cemetery she had never been to, a place she could have had no possible way of finding on her own, not by scent, not by memory, not by any explanation that made ordinary sense. Margaret was not, by nature, a woman who believed in signs. She had gone to church her whole life more out of habit and community than conviction, and she had always privately rolled her eyes, just slightly, at people who claimed to see God's hand in every coincidence. But sitting on her kitchen floor with the phone slipping from her hand and Sunday's warm weight pressed against her ribs, Margaret found herself doing something she hadn't done in months. She started to cry. Not the tired, hollow crying of the last 3 months, but something bigger, something that felt like it was finally moving through her instead of just sitting in her chest. Because somehow, against every possible odd, the dog her husband had once loved enough to save and been forced to give away had found her way back, not to Robert, because Robert was gone, but to the one place that still held him, and in doing that, she had found Margaret too. That night, Margaret sat on the back porch long after dark, wrapped in Robert's old flannel jacket. The same one, she now understood with a fresh wave of tears, that he had once wrapped around a shivering, broken puppy on the side of a highway. Sunday lay across her feet, chin resting on Margaret's slipper, breathing slow and even in the cold November air. "You knew, didn't you?" Margaret said quietly, to the dark, to the yard, to whoever might be listening. "You went looking for him. And you found the next best thing." She thought about all the years she and Robert had spent avoiding another pet, protecting themselves from the particular grief of loving an animal and eventually losing it, and how Robert had carried this secret the whole time, a private ache he'd never once burdened her with, a small act of love and sacrifice he'd made alone, in a motel room 2 hours from home, and then let go of because he thought it was the right thing to do. She understood, finally, why he'd stopped the car for turtles. Why he couldn't drive past a dog on a highway shoulder without checking. Why some small, tender part of him had apparently never stopped wondering what happened to a puppy named Goldie. And she understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones and stayed there, that she was never letting this dog go. The weeks that followed felt different. Margaret still drove to the cemetery most mornings, and Sunday still climbed into the car without being asked, but the visits changed shape. Margaret found herself talking to Robert differently now, not with the flat, aching loneliness of before, but with something that felt almost like gratitude, almost like being let in on a secret he'd kept just for the two of them to eventually discover together. She told him she'd found the folder. She told him she understood now. She told him, one cold morning with frost silvering the grass and Sunday curled at the base of his headstone, that she forgave him for never telling her, not because there was anything to forgive, but because saying it out loud felt like closing a door gently instead of slamming it. She had the vet run the numbers again, just to be sure, cross-referencing the healed fracture, the age, the timeline, and everything matched. She contacted the rescue organization one final time, not out of doubt, but out of a need to make it official, to put Robert's name and Sunday's story into some kind of permanent record. The coordinator, moved by the whole account, mailed Margaret a copy of the original surrender paperwork. Robert's own signature at the bottom, dated 5 years back, along with a small handwritten note in the corner of the file that the coordinator said she'd kept for herself all this time because it had touched her. "Please find her a family that will love her the way she deserves." "I wish it could be mine." Margaret framed that piece of paper. It sits now on the same shelf as their wedding photograph, a strange and beautiful bookend to a marriage that, it turned out, still had one more story left to tell her. Sunday, for her part, seemed to settle in a way Margaret hadn't seen since the morning they met. The whining at the door eased. The long, mournful minutes spent pressed against the headstone grew shorter, then eventually stopped altogether, as though the dog, too, had finally found whatever she'd been searching for and could rest now. These days, she still visits the cemetery with Margaret, but she spends most of the time chasing squirrels along the tree line or lying in a patch of sun near the bench, tail thumping lazily, present in the moment instead of anchored to the past. At home, she has become something Margaret never expected to need again at 68 years old, a reason to get up in the morning that has nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with love. She has her own bed in the corner of the bedroom, a ridiculous, overstuffed thing that Margaret ordered without really deciding to, and she still, every single night, ends up climbing onto the actual bed anyway, curling into the space against Margaret's side, exactly where Robert used to sleep, as if some understanding had passed between the two of them that this spot needed a keeper. Margaret's children have both met Sunday now, and both, in their own way, cried the first time they heard the whole story laid out from beginning to end. Claire because she'd half-guessed it all along, Danny because he hadn't expected to, sitting at his mother's kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands the same way Robert's always used to. Danny flew in the following weekend, the first time he'd made the trip since the funeral, and Margaret watched from the kitchen window as her grown son sat down cross-legged on the back lawn, still in the button-down shirt he'd worn on the plane, and let Sunday climb halfway into his lap the way she did with everyone. He stayed like that a long time, not saying much, just running his hand slowly over her ears, and when he finally came inside, his eyes were red, and he didn't try to hide it. "I keep thinking about him driving 2 hours the wrong way," he said, "and never telling a soul." That's so exactly him it hurts. Claire came the month after, drove up from 3 states over with her own 2 kids in the back seat, and stood in the driveway crying before she'd even said hello, because Sunday had trotted straight out to greet the car, the same eager way Biscuit used to when they were children coming home from school, and for a moment, Claire said later, it felt like the whole family had somehow gotten a small piece of something back that they thought was gone for good. "Dad would have loved this," Claire told her mother on the phone, voice thick. "He would have loved that she came back." "She didn't come back for him," Margaret said, looking down at Sunday, who was watching her with those same steady brown eyes she'd had that very first morning at the grave. "I think, in a way, she came back for both of us." Margaret still doesn't have every answer. She doesn't know exactly how Sunday ended up loose from that transport van, or how she found her way, over what must have been dozens of miles, to a cemetery she had no possible memory of, to the grave of a man she'd only known for a handful of weeks as a puppy 5 years earlier. Nobody can explain that with certainty, and Margaret has stopped needing them to. Some things, she has decided, are allowed to stay a little bit unexplainable. Some things are just called grace. What she does know is this: Robert loved that dog enough to save her life on the side of a lonely highway, and reluctant enough to let her go because he thought it was the right thing to do. And somehow, in a way that no insurance policy or logical explanation will ever fully account for, that single act of love, quiet, private, sacrificial, something he never once mentioned in 41 years of marriage, found its way back around to save Margaret's life too, in the exact season she needed saving most. She thinks about that most mornings now, sitting on the porch with her coffee, Sunday's head resting heavy and warm across her lap, the sun coming up slow and gold over the yard, the same color as the dog who found her way home twice. Winter came, and with it the first snow Margaret had ever shoveled alone, and she found herself laughing out loud in the cold when Sunday bulldozed straight through the drifts like a puppy half her age, snow clinging to her muzzle, circling back again and again to make sure Margaret was still following. It struck her, standing there in her husband's old barn coat with a shovel in her gloved hands, that this was exactly the kind of small, unremarkable, wonderful moment grief had convinced her she'd never get to have again. An ordinary morning, made bright by something living and warm at her side. She thought of Robert then, not with the sharp ache of July, but with something softer, something almost like company, as though some part of him really had found a way to keep watching over her. After all, tucked inside the very dog he'd once wrapped in his own coat on the side of a lonely highway. If you've ever lost someone you loved and found comfort in the most unexpected place, an animal who showed up right when you needed them most, you already know exactly what Margaret felt that morning at the grave. Maybe you've lived some version of this story yourself. Maybe a dog, or a cat, or some other four-legged soul walked into your life at the exact moment your heart couldn't hold itself together, and somehow, without a single word, put some of the pieces back. We'd love to hear it. Was there ever an animal who found you at the lowest moment of your life, almost like they were sent there on purpose? And if you have a pet resting near you right now while you're watching this, what's one thing about them that reminds you of someone you've loved and lost? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and these stories matter more than you know. If this story moved you even a little, give it a like before you go. It genuinely helps more people find these stories who need them. And if you love these kinds of human and animal bond stories, hit that subscribe button, because every single week we bring you a brand new story that will touch your heart the same way this one just did. Because somewhere out there, right now, there's probably another Margaret, another Sunday, another story of love that refused to end just because someone did. A quiet act of kindness, done years ago and never spoken of, still finding its way home long after the person who did it is gone. And maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point. Maybe love was never something we were meant to hold on to so tightly, but something we were meant to keep passing forward, one small rescue at a time, until it finds exactly who it was always meant to find.